from Germany would visit and perform in London. Sir Ian was kind enough to invite the AA to make a contribution to the festival, and I was pleased to accept on behalf of the association. In pondering the best way to respond, I was reminded of the long history of association between the AA and Berlin, dating back, for example, to the Smithson's remarkable competition entries in the immediate post-World War II era, and the opportunities offered to such friends of the AA as Eduardo Paolozzi and James Sterling, amongst others of that generation. Berlin as a city has inspired a newfound sense of professional direction and dignity in many of the young, talented, and aspiring graduates and faculty of this school, and similar young architects from other countries who have too often been overlooked at home. And I thought it would be best to give some of them the opportunity to present their schemes here in front of the audience of Berliners and representatives from some of the cultural agencies, German cultural agencies in this city. I speak of Jan Krier, who unfortunately did not accept the invitation to take part. The OMA team, Rem Koolhaas, Elias Galis, Silly and Madeline, and their younger assistants, Alex Wall, Stefan Martinez, and Stockman, have been involved in a series of Berlin projects. I speak of here, Zaha Hadid, I also speak of Chris McDonald and Peter Salter, who unfortunately are unable to present their most recent scheme for Berlin because it was part of competition and is not being judged yet. And similarly with Daniel Eden's scheme. These presentations will be followed by a further discussion after dinner in the library with our Berlin guests, Fritz Neumeier, Hans Koolhoff, and Christoph Langhoff. It is my pleasure to welcome you all, and I also would like at this time to offer the apologies of Professor Julius Posner, who is ill and could not make it, and similarly for Christine Hall. I'm going to call now on Pascal Schoning, who has agreed to act as chairman for this meeting and for this evening's discussion. Pascal Schoning.
Good evening. I must say I'm a bit nervous because there was such an amount of work to do to get it all together, to organize it, to think about what I will say, what I can do, how to do it, and so. And I also lived so very long in Berlin. And then when you live somewhere, you know the city or place very well, but at the same time, you know so much that you maybe can't give clear statements about that place because personal things are involved and so much happens through the town. So when I now speak a bit very short about Berlin, it is very personal. Berlin is 750. There's said and written so much about the history of Berlin and the architectural history of Berlin. Historically right and wrong, and it depends very much on the personal position, how to see it, even parts or aspects, more as everywhere else, more as normal. I lived there for 20 years, and so I'm afraid to relate to any one of those specific interpretations I'm very emotional in my thinking. So I appreciate Julius Posner's statement when he gave the speech for the opening of the 750-year Berlin exhibition this year. Instead of referring directly to the 751st day, he said, "Today is the 100th birthday of the architect Erich Mendelsohn." And that shows that the statements people in Berlin give about Berlin are all personal. And he also said 750 years are a lie in a way, because there was nothing really before the Renaissance. I even would prefer to start thinking later, even not with Schinkel, who influenced modern architecture so much. For me, there are only the last 75 years, counting in a way, where modern architecture somehow started from there, maybe in the office of Peter Behrens, where for a while Mies van der Rohe worked, where Le Corbusier worked, where Gropius worked. And I really think this is the initial bit, and also typical for Berlin. There's no real Berlin, no real Berliners. Berlin has always been a real fiction. People were coming there, stay for a while, bring influence into the city, get influence from there, and were going back to the real world and spread the influence. So they always did. And I think this is because of Berlin is at the border between East and West, Moscow and Paris. The influence of both sides is big. And look at that real, unreal city. From those 75 years, over the half time, it is exactly the border, physically the border between East and West. That, I think, was only the logic of its position in geography, politics, culture. If there is a history, it is a history of new movements and new ideas which are then realized for a while and destroyed. Nothing is really finished because the ideas are changing and older are not anymore in favor. So Berlin is a place to set statements, and it is a museum of those statements. There are no any more continuous homogeneous parts of the city. It is a row of statement areas, east and west. But those aspects are giving the possibility to react quite quickly, and so since 75 years, a lot of people got the opportunity to do something there. The last one was the Iber, and maybe most of the speakers today got the chance to build there for the first time in her life. I would like to say something finally about the choice of the participants. They are all AA-related architects who teach or taught here and have given also a very personal and influential statement and have set new points in the architectural discussion. I think it's a pity that Daniel Libeskind, Peter Salter, and Chris MacDonald can't speak because of this running Berlin competition they are involved. Anyway, I think we should start with the first speakers, Alison and Peter Smithson, who are for me already a part in the Berlin architectural scene. They have done so much there, but never got the chance to build there. I remember their proposal to flood Berlin because it is already an island, for example. And when I was young in Berlin, their school in Handstand and in Norfolk impressed me so much, and still is influencing me. But I should stop here and give the word to Alison and Peter.
I shall speak for Alison and myself, but try to distinguish where, of the projects, one was more dominant than the other. The content repeats in different words what Pascal has already said. The piece is entitled Berlin as the Island of Our Mind. In our work for Berlin, we have worked through several, so far 4 periods of different, but at the time generally accepted attitudes. But we were always working with what we saw as the pertinent architectural urban potential, with evolving an architecture urban language, serving aspirations just coming into being. The first of these periods was the 50s. The 50s in Berlin seemed hopeful. We foreigners could walk freely from west to east, east to west. The Berliner Ensemble was producing the best theatre in Europe. Therefore, it was possible to believe that Berlin could be unified. Therefore, the competition, the political competition for Hauptstadt Berlin was not entered into by us with any cynicism. We believed that Berlin would be unified. And therefore, we concentrated on an urban structuring that embraced both sides and accepted the likely increase of traffic flow around the city. Now, I could have the slides. Can you put out the...
Yeah.
This is the only slide we have of the actual competition drawing. The concept, one of a network in which the vehicular system was given a different geometry to the pedestrian system. There were 3 components: traffic system, pedestrian, traffic net, pedestrian net, and the green space. They were locked together in a form of what we then call contra-geometries. That is, one geometry playing against another. And as you can see, the project envisaged a real regeneration of Berlin as the capital of Europe and the crossing point between East and West. The next period, the 60s, we had to face that the unification of Berlin was unlikely, and that we had to deal with a half of a city, a half that where the frontier made a shape for the western portion like a look of your hand, with the Marienplatz at about this point. When the city was divided, the can I walk about? No. I walk about, I leave the microphone. The deepest, the longest thought of project for the Berlin Hauptstadt was that of Hans Scharoun. And in his Hauptstadt, the grain of the city went from east to west. Once you accepted that a north-south axis was impossible because of the border running across it, the grain running with the Tiergarten seemed to be the obvious fabric for the city. Therefore, the 60s, in accepting the splitting of the city as a permanent thing, with the permanent handling of an ever-increasing traffic load, our second project for the Marienplatz looked back at Scharoun's Hauptstadt. Scharoun's Hauptstadt accepted the green-centered city and realized the horizontal east-to-west structuring potential of the Tiergarten. Therefore, at the time of the Marienplatz project, we accepted an idea of a linear system with things pendant on it. One of the things that was pendant on it was the development at the Marienplatz. That is, it was no longer the end of an axis, but something hanging off a series of horizontal string, one of a series of things hanging. So the distribution is at the top, the grain is running east-west. No. In the 70s, the attitude that was generally accepted was to consolidate the existing fabric. And our studies in that decade were trying to make the existing half city more adherent. In the Kreuzberg project, the keeping of the integrity of the city block and quietening the space behind it. Two projects for Kreuzberg. in 76, can I have that off? Well, that was 75. 76, another infill project on the Landwehr Canal. 77, a bridge over the Verbindungs Canal. And in 80, with the collapse of the Congress Hall, how do I make it go again? With the collapse of the Congress Hall, a series of projects organized by the Aedes Gallery for a monument to the collapse of a building. And we made a tree for the Berliner Bear to live in. Now at this point we begin to pick up connections with AA people. That drawing was made by Ira Fagan, who was an AA graduate. In 1980 was the beginning of the EBR period, and we made a competition on the Lutzerstrasse, still pursuing the idea of adherency within the conglomerate of the half of the city. But something completely new was entering, and I would have thought this was no longer a period of infill, but had already moved into the period where the green, the new contract with nature, began to fight through into an aesthetic. So this project is one which responds to the climate, to a sun-accepting south space, an energy-conservant north face. It took as its model the summer tram of Berlin, where after Easter passed, the tram cars became white with white awnings, white curtains. And we wanted to make a building that when the summer came, it would change like the trams once changed. So this picture captures, I think, the change in one's sensibility. We now wish to cohere with the periods of the year, cycle of the year. So that we've made a project in which it was obvious where the sun would come in and where the sun would be kept out, the north and the south, the north and the south, the south. And this is the bit that's supposed to look like the tram car. It's more like a train picking up power at the top of the tram car. And with a plan which changes its density from the north side to the south side. And I can see that this, the organization of the plan to respond to aspect is going to occupy the next 15 years. And you can see the thought that was given to the way it behaved in relation to its situation. same components from the main building are used in the subsidiary building. This is a youth club. And from the youth club, you can jump over the canal into the greener parts of the city. The building was used as a wall. The wall built a territory. In the territory you had the garden buildings. I mean, it's a continuous theme. Could I have these lights on? There are four periods. The period when there was a conscious attempt to unify Berlin formally. The period of acceptance of the split. The period when the fabric was attempted to be infilled. And finally, something much more radical, that is that you do have a green city which is capable of producing adherent fabrics which cohese the city of the nature of the architecture, and they're taking in the greenery and the sun and so on into themselves. The aesthetic, in a way, is non-formal. That Berlin has been, from 57 to 87, 30 years, an island of our mind. The city to which we've enjoyed being asked to return, and here I repeat Pascal, more or less word for word. We've found it a heroic place, a seminal place, that has repeatedly enabled us to prepare our thoughts for action elsewhere. I'm sorry to use your script again, but you can see that the Hauptstadt produced in our work the Economist building, and in other people's work the buildings on the South Bank, the most hated buildings in London, are the product of the Hauptstadt competition. In another 10 years, those buildings will be as well thought of as Somerset House. You know, it's just the period of deep gloom after something remarkable has been achieved. The second period of Marienplatz, you use the buildings to protect the territory. And that is the thing we're continuing to use. From Marienplatz, putting the vehicles in the moat, protecting the territory, putting the vehicles below ground, you get Robin Hood Gardens. In Lutzaustrasse was the beginning of the signaling of the new contract with nature, which led to the Maryhill competition, which again was rejected. But it led, we were able in the Maryhill to establish the real costs for the first time of these very modest attempts to energy conservant, sun welcoming buildings of the most primitive sort, are 40% more expensive than the kind of Sharon Revival apartments which you can see in the gallery. And if they're more complex, as the Lutzaustrasse was, the likelihood is that the investment would be 60% higher than a Sharon Revival apartment house. Therefore, to realize it is an extremely serious operation, because you have to find somebody, and one always hoped it would be the IBA, who was prepared to spend 60% more to build an apartment house. Nevertheless, it found its Berlin was the vehicle by which that thought and subsequently the more serious application of it entered our work. The half city still remains to be addressed. In it, we ought to bring about adherency because of what we now recognize and are now calling conglomerate urban space. Conglomerate urban space, things addes to the building. Everywhere we have lost sight of the power of the conglomerate, lost the understanding of its nature, because it alludes to categories of history and style outside those we have been taught through the books. At this point I also become eclectic, because you're going to get a small quotation. Charles Eames could see this. Quote, "The new tradition we expect may well turn out to be rooted in a search for restraints, a tradition of problem structuring, not a tradition of finished form. And the forms developed in such a tradition may well have to relinquish some of the visual uniformity we seem to cherish." And then 2 paragraphs of one's own rhetoric. That a building's first duty is to the fabric of which it forms part, is, we believe, that understanding which separated the Team 10 generation from the one which preceded it, the generation of the 1930s. It was an understanding not easily arrived at, and was probably a consequence of our instinct to make buildings as fabrics. That is, the Hauptstadt was not a series of buildings, it was a fabric. And that was an instinctive move. Certainly, Hauptstadt was consciously a fabric. Its spatial form was the counterpart of an imagined social form of tangible freedom and mobility. As we now see it, in a conglomerate urban arrangement, it is the buildings which have adhesion and the space absorbency. Whilst West Berlin remains an island, we will be able to pursue our studies. Thank you, Pascal.
So because we have so many speakers, I think we continue directly, and if you have some questions, you could do that maybe later. The next speaker is Peter Cook of Peter Cook, Christine Hawley. As we heard, Christine Hawley through. I think Peter Cook is maybe the most experimental and so influential architect over a long time I know. For me, he is someone in architecture like Andy Warhol is for art. With archigrams, they changed. With archigrams, they changed theme architecture. Christine Hawley, when Peter Cook and Christine Hawley started to work together, maybe brought a different kind of vitality into the group, and those both vitalities together produced a lot of more buildable designs, I would say. And as I heard, their building in Berlin will be started next month. Peter, please.
I may be forgiven, I hope, for also dwelling very, very little bit in this public arena. I'm sure it's going to come back into the conversation in the more elite group upstairs, but in the public arena, this curious phenomenon of Berlin, the fact that Berlin has from time to time a tolerance of various people on the London scene, in particular the AA scene, and it also a personal thing for me that Peter Smithson was speaking first, because it was he who had made Hauptstadt Berlin project about 3 or 4 years before the point at which I was his student in 5th year at this school, and it was the built manifestation of a little piece of Hauptstadt Berlin, if you think about it, which is the Economist project that he was doing the working drawings on when we were his students, and in a sense the continuity runs on and on right through to Peter Salter, who of course was not only our student but was his assistant, their assistant I should say, and so on and so forth. This umbilical cord. Also, I think very importantly, the mention that Peter made of the Aedes gallery, which for many of us has been a kind of offshore piece of the AA family. It has been it's a little shop premises which puts on many exhibitions of the sorts of people that teach you here and that you hear here. And I think that there's the other aspect of Berlin and London which perhaps come together in my mind, since I masquerade as a kind of Middle European from time to time. If you sit in Middle Europe, meaning brackets Frankfurt, the fascination with what is going on in London is perhaps only paralleled by the fascination of what is going on in Vienna or in Los Angeles. I've mentioned these 4 cities as having some kind of mythical intriguement, probably out of all proportion to what actually goes on in those places, and that there is a mysterious traffic which has to, particularly from the Berlin, has to pass through Frankfurt Airport, because it is an island and you can't fly directly to the States from there. And there is a higher proportion, this is my observation, it's a higher proportion of spooky, interesting, eccentric, or whatever other term one can think of the sorts of people one likes in the Berlin architectural scene than any other in that part of Europe, disproportionately to the amount of work that there is there. And so it is a city to which one goes and always finds friends, and a city to which one goes and gets that curious mixture, which I think one has in London, of both vitality and calmness if you need it. A very vital condition, one corner of the street, and you can just retreat into total calmness, which is not characteristic of, let us say, Paris or New York, but I digress. You take yourself with you, I think. I'm still in a quandary in my own mind as to what should be the correct attitude towards building housing in Berlin. Should one go as a responsible builder of what is, after all, something more akin to local authority housing? It is cheap housing for fairly ordinary people, so that is the story. It is not special housing for yuppies, though I think a number of yuppies do move in afterwards, but it purports to be modest income housing, and it is built for the IBA to very stringent cost controls. On the other hand, you do take yourself with you, and it is reasonable therefore to state what one would really like about domestic architecture, if permitted, and I deliberately take number 2 Holland Park Avenue, which is one of my favourite pieces of housing. I've never been inside it, and a very strange lady in a hat appears through the door from time to time. But it does characterise in one slide all of those vagaries of the English Arcadian tradition. It is neither classic nor Gothic. It does not conform, and yet there are parts of it which do conform. It is essentially private, and of course it is in a state of elegant decay. You don't, of course, build that kind of thing. And at the same time, it is the inspiration of Berlin that there are a few heroic and original buildings that just stick in the memory. I can never remember the name of the architect of this building, but I pass it like twice a day if I'm ever in Berlin. Somebody can tell me who. It's fine, I shall forget again in 10 minutes. But you all know it, and it's a constant source of inspiration, I think, because it appears to do the commonplace of its period. And then you actually look at the topography of it, as it were, and it does anything but the commonplace. Another favourite piece of Berlin is one which is about 8 blocks, 8 corners away from what we hope will be called Zaha's Corner at some point. 8 blocks into town along the Kurdamm. I don't know who did this either, but it intrigues me, and it suggests that there was something about the essentially bourgeois nature, the get-rich-quick nature of Berlin. After all, Berlin really developed over about an 80-year period towards the end of the last century, and a lot of people came into it rather quickly, and some of them built very exuberantly. And I think it is my irritation with the IBA that it has not permitted very much exuberance. Somehow or other, the IBA still remains a slightly worthy, po-faced kind of event. Maybe there isn't the money, but I wonder if there's even the imagination. And I regret having, I just found this slide. It sort of typifies for me the sort of reasonable Berlin building. I think it's actually by the late Mr. Grotzebuch, who was apparently a nice man, but it's very typical of the sort of thing that has happened in Berlin in the last 10 years. It is hyper-concerned with the conservation or the reconstitution of the city block. Now, of course, in this country we are difficult about the city block thing, because A, we never really, like is our tradition, which is that we're not very good at sustaining things. We're too much a fall-about kind of culture here. But we never really took to city blocks very much. As soon as we got a few city blocks, we start playing with them and hope that they break down. Nor were we as intensively bombed and battered as the German cities. And so one can read that the reintegration of the city block was both part of the tradition, but was also an emotional question. The reconstitution, even sometimes when there wasn't a city block there to reconstitute. You find that all of the German architecture and urbanism students are taught the rules of the city block and how to constitute them and reconstitute them, even if they weren't there before. And I think that this does have a mixture of reasons. And so here we see, quite typically, the reconstituted city block with something just permitted to be slightly different on the corner, but not very much. I find this sort of building worthy and tedious. And I was ironically invited about 2.5 years ago, 2 years ago, to make a film for German television on the IBA. And I think the film ended up by being far too polite. But I thought it was quite snide at the time. The irony was that having just finished the film, they said, right, you go and do one. And one is then very humble about the results. Of course, there have been other machinations in Berlin. It is intriguing to me, the tremendous influence that Matthias Ungers, and I'm sad that he won't be here this evening, because in a sense, just as when one goes to Karlsruhe, the ghost of Ehrman seems to ride, or if you go to Chicago, the ghost of Mies, etc. There are all these ghosts. I mean, he's still alive, Ungers, but in a sense, his ghost is there in Berlin because half the gentlemen sitting here from Berlin are, and a very, very high proportion, something like 70% of the most interesting and most creative young Berlin and Frankfurt area architects are actually ex-students or ex-assistants of Matthias Ungers. And one can't discount that. One can't pretend that it isn't there, or that he doesn't live somewhere in their veins. I just chose this for naughty reasons, because in a sense it represents both the progeny of Ungas. I think it's done by Jürgen Savada and some of his friends, at a middle period roughly between the Hansaviertel, which was the previous building exhibition, the one in which Gropius and Niemeyer and all those guys did their things in a park, which I actually prefer to most of the Eber stuff, and I suspect Zaha does as well. It's certainly much closer to her taste. But this is a middle period one, roughly at the halfway point between the Hansaviertel and the period of the Eber, so that we see still a certain degree of heroic or even bombast in the creation of the block. And also we see that it isn't just a continuation and a foreclosing of the block, that it's a sort of finger that's stuck out to continue but not reproduce the block. And I'm intrigued, I don't like the building, but I'm intrigued by it as a phenomenon. And so one then comes to one's own response, or I should say our own response. We are very conscious in the Eber of being surrounded by other architects who are much more inspired by rationalist bases than are we. And it amused us to comment on that. And it also amused us to say, all right, we can do a bit of that rationalist stuff too. We can make all these windows square and reasonable and a flat facade. Because we couldn't bring ourselves to completely play it straight. And so we say, well, the spirited architecture is going to infiltrate it. And it so conveniently happened that this face of what is basically a small piece of a side of a block, we are willy-nilly forced into sustaining this mythical block. I seem to remember seeing the photographs of the old Lutzerplatz, but actually it wasn't as totally integrated a block as it will be when it's been rebuilt. It was much more like Notting Hill Gate. It was much more a piece of bourgeois Arcadia with a lot of trees and lots of slightly funky corners. So it's not a question of replacing what is there, it is replacing again the mythology of Berlin, the city of the completed blocks. But I digress slightly. This is the east-facing side of our little building, sandwiched between others. And of course, even in Berlin, the sun rises in the east, and one wakes up and one has one's bedroom, and so it is very reasonable to have, the straightforward thing of the bedrooms, the bathrooms, facing onto the eastern side, which is also the quieter side, and the living space is picking up the sun as it turns round to the west and the southwest, which faces what we hope will be rather better developed as a park. We're told that there is a competition, or there has been a competition, for the reconstitution of the Lutzerplatz, which is a sort of town square, and the reduction of the main traffic which at the moment runs past it. We can only hope for this, and therefore intend that the living spaces automatically are on the west side, are on the green side, are on the sunny side, and face out over the park. And so it is reasonable to have two different kinds of skin following that orientation. I think the other thing that I should mention is that both Christine and I have worked in offices building housing to the famous Parker Morris standards. And I've noticed already that compared with some of our neighbours, that we, coming from this sort of penny-pinching English Parker Morris background, are used to conversations about, you'll have to move the partition 2 inches because that'll save so much money, and anyhow the pram goes under the staircase. All of that sort of thing which one sort of sneers at on the one hand, but is rather familiar with on the other hand. And we didn't, and essentially also coming probably from this tradition, we basically designed the building from the inside to the outside. we didn't make any drawings of either of the facades until we had got pretty near to the end of the design of the dwelling units. We drew most of the various, and there were many early arrangements of the building in section before we started really pinpointing the plans. And I think that essentially comes from a tradition. Perhaps you might say it comes originally from a 60s tradition, though Christine, were she here, would carpet that description. But I think it comes essentially from a spatial and knitting designing position, rather than, as we notice many of the EBA pieces of housing, where you perfect the facade and then stick some rooms behind it, and the facade becomes tremendous. You know, the reiteration of the facade becomes the primary thing. I'm just showing here a rather early version of the same project, before we had our hands sat on and told not to do so many maisonettes, because we really were thinking of this business of bringing the light into the center of the building, of knitting, of giving some relief to the boxy quality that so much local authority housing has. And we've even had boring discussions and battles over the question of how many centimeters height we can buy. It is the problem of small flats, and I as a child have lived in a lot of small boxy flats, and I know how tedious they can be. And so the planning was essentially three-dimensional. It was essentially, as I say, from the inside out, was essentially to do with trying to get as many diagonal glimpses, as many bits of beam of the sun, and as many possibly spooky corners as you could, without having every apartment different. Trying to be rational to the extent of bringing load-bearing conditions down where they have to be brought without the whole thing jiggling around. Making the technically more complex parts able to be applied to the basic structure rather than necessarily carved out of it. And we have, I think, 8 types of apartment in a block that only has 13 anyway. A typical apartment is this one on the right, where you can see that in this case a double height space, an internal bathroom, the bedroom onto the quiet back court. And you will notice, that will come up better on another slide, the beginning of some internal pieces of architecture, which are the towers. These are very important and really stem from conversations that started with this thing that was made in Milan called His and Hers, which is something between the scale of a piece of furniture and the scale of a room. The notion, which actually was started as a tradition by the Smithsons themselves way back in projects such as the Appliance House, the House of Tomorrow, and the notion that the appliance generates an internal architecture of pieces which take on their own continuity with the space, that you don't just sort of make the box of the room and then hope that the furniture that comes in is all right, nor do you necessarily just fit up kitchens and fit up bay windows and hope that the rest of the interpretation is all right. What you do is, if you can get away with it, is to scatter the space with certain nodal elements. I'll come back to that again. As we turn to the park facade, one sees this common space of the family, the double height spaces where they do exist, and the living room spaces bursting out and grinning at you by way of the winter gardens. These internal appliances then start to congregate around the kitchen area, and this is very much part of Christine's interest in kitchens and cooking and the development of kitchens, that one has a kind of node point for the kitchen, but you don't have these tedious strips of cupboards that you hope that the food activity will sort of infiltrate the space. Difficult to do with these tight floor-to-ceiling heights. And so we then start playing other tricks by deliberately stepping the concrete slab floor by floor by floor, just so that one gets the impression of greater height without us actually using any more volume. One, on some of the apartments, then of course gets the full see-through conditions, so that the kitchen node tends to creep further towards the back of the building. This is the winter garden here, and I'm hoping there are a couple of slides that are going to come up that feature winter gardens, because these slides were taken on my very first visit to Berlin about 15 years ago, where we were taken round the town by Eduardo Palozzi, who's probably the ideal person to confront the place with first off. And the thing that really stuck in my memory right from then was the relative exuberance, not only architecturally, but sometimes personally, when people used their balcony. Here we have a bourgeois version. I think there's a... No. Oh, we jumped to... Yeah, here's a Tatia version in, I think, Kreuzberg, which, as you know, is a run-down part of Berlin, where suddenly the whole thing comes alive. Never mind the asbestos sheeting, but the whole life comes alive on the balcony. And it was useful, therefore, that in the brief was the requirement that every apartment should have a winter garden, and that these winter gardens, I think, are really where the English playing around on the windowsill tradition and the Berlin playing around on the windowsill tradition come together. It's a little piece, if you like, a little piece of Arcadia that is permitted by the block. And it's fascinating to read all the regulations as they come through, that you have to hug the block line and fall in love with this myth of the block, except in the winter gardens, where you're actually permitted then to stick out, I think it's 1.5 meters. And I think there's a great irony in all of that. One would be dishonest if one did not admit that there were other Porco projects that existed where some of the geometric games, if you like, have been tried out before. This was our Peak project, and that there is also, of course, the strange bit of Berlin architecture, which is sometimes called Gothic, though I think it's actually something else, which one isn't really permitted to talk about. It's not a favoured tradition in Berlin. I mean, there are other traditions that are much more favoured by the intellectuals, but nonetheless, they can't stop you noticing these things out of the corner of your eye. There's also, of course, the Blue House, which was our solar house designed for another part of Germany, which, in a roundabout way, did sustain some of the thinking on the Luxorplatz. It too was facing north-south. It too keeps a very private condition to the north and an exuberant condition to the south, though in this case some of the sort of geometric pools, which are similar to our south facade in Berlin, occur here on the north facade. Back to the axonometrics and the fact that one then bursts also towards the top of the building. The stack of the very small apartments, and this was something which was a requirement of the brief, that we provided 5 of these really fairly pokey, actually one-room apartments, but still trying to keep to the basic partie of the nucleated appliance towers and the winter garden. We wanted to cling on to that even in the smallest apartments. And gradually, as the scheme opens up, one has a roof condition with something like a kind of maison Jouw apartment, which becomes a studio using the roof itself. But actually, the generic plan remains the same, so it became for us an interesting play of how much variety we could get out of basically 3 plans: the left-hand side plan, the right-hand side plan, and the box room in the middle. And that, as far as the development of the scheme, has really been the generic thing. Upstairs you can see various versions of this facade as it has developed. And since, for instance, this morning I was working on the handrail details, I can tell you that it's developing by the hour at the moment, since we're under great pressure to finish the working drawings. You will have noted this as the drawing of the latest date. Whilst in Lincoln, Nebraska, we were able to develop the bay window, and the bay window has become slightly more regularized. I think the rest of the building is continuing as was. The greatest headache that we're facing now is the word that the chosen contractor is one of the most penny pinching in the business, and it is the report from all our friends there that the worst thing is that we lose some of the nice bits, and I think this is something that faces all of us. That is in processing through, one has heard various horror stories from the Omar group, for example, and just about everybody else, including Matthias Ungers, who there's a marvelous story that on the building across the street that we don't like, but nonetheless was intended to have windows that were about 30 centimeters larger, and that the builders, because they had a job lot of windows, just put in what they had. That is pretty terrifying. We hope that we hold on to the whole thing, of course, and we hope that we're clever enough at thinking all of the pragmatic reasons why this and that and that and this and that occur, which are highly pragmatic and highly functional and very much based upon our experience with Parker Morris and all of that bullshit. But even were they not to, the basic carved out spaces are idiosyncratic enough that they can't kill those. I know that sounds a slightly negative point upon which to stop, but everybody's saying to you, my God, you know, at the age of 50 and you're finally building, don't you feel excited? Answer, no, I don't feel anything. I think that Berlin is a very strange city. I am slightly scared by the fact that there are several architects who have built in the IBA whose work I really admire, and from whom I've seen some brilliant buildings. In general, their IBA buildings are not their best, to put it mildly. In fact, there's some bummers. And when we were making the film, it did get very embarrassing from time to time. We just had to sort of put a hand over the end of the lens and say, well, let's pretend it's not here. If one's starting from the other end, and this is our first major structure, I don't know what might happen. I personally think that we're not interested whether the facade is fashionable, unfashionable, characteristic or uncharacteristic. I think we're very interested in the apartment, strangely enough. I think we're really excited about those things, about getting diagonal views and of turning beds around corners and having these funny towers, and enjoying the deformation of the most expensive part of the building, which is the winter garden, hoping that it gets very mossy and very messy and full of funny trinkets that those old ladies put out there. Maybe that's being very English about it. I don't know. Maybe we'll discuss that later. Thank you.
I saw Rem hiding around the corner. So our next speaker is Rem Koolhaas from OMA, and I think OMA brought back or reintroduced the axis Moscow, New York, when they showed their first designs. And I think so it's only natural that they finally did schemes for Berlin, which lays in the way of that.
Can I have the first slide? Can I control the slides from here or not?
Yes, there's a forward button
Oh
there.
yeah. Okay. Okay, I'll start right away. I will show two projects, one dating from 1981, and I will show what we're doing there now. I think that what was always extremely exhilarating about the idea of Berlin, and I think that this slide really represents it well, is that in Berlin during the 20s and 30s, the whole idea of a metropolis in Europe, or in other words, a European interpretation or articulation of the metropolis, was established, I think, more in Berlin than anywhere else in Europe. And I think that this image is, in a way, of a Mies project for Alexanderplatz is, in a way, very revealing and very typical, since it shows that from the beginning there was a very careful attempt to not have an articulus on a metropolis on its own terms, but to have a kind of modern form of architecture that could coexist, whether it wanted to or not, simply by the fact of being in the center of a historical city with history. In other words, let's say the American form of metropolis is very radical in being autonomous and not referential to any historical fact. I think that in Berlin, through historical circumstance, it was almost inevitable that that new invention, the metropolis, would have to coexist with whatever remained of history. And I think that Berlin has been particularly fertile in finding ways of defining this coexistence. I think that maybe in this image, if you can focus it, you have, for me, this was an image which we produced as part of our competition entry for a competition in Friedrichstadt, which is the historical center of Berlin, where we did some research of the kind of historical projects that had been proposed before our intervention. And I think that not coincidentally, it contained three important elements, this part of Berlin, one by Mendelssohn, one by Hildesheimer, and one by Mies. And as a kind of exercise before our own project, we tried to investigate kind of what relationship these projects had with history. It was very interesting to discover that this particular image that Hildesheimer, which for the modern metropolis by Hildesheimer, dating from the 20s, was actually not a self-referential project, but was proposed for the heart of Berlin in kind of very obvious juxtaposition with one very beautiful neoclassical complex of churches. So, in other words, that Hildesheimer had been very conscious of placing his scheme exactly in the heart and the most historically charged part of the city. It was even more interesting to discover that the famous triangular tower of Mies, the famous glass tower that is usually presented in a very abstract way without showing any evidence of any context, was actually a very contextual project, which maybe is clear in this famous presentation drawing, where you realize that the juxtaposition of this scheme in the context of Friedrichstrasse is very important to Mies, and that Friedrichstrasse is rendered as a kind of very bleak, somber environment from which this glass crystal rises. But what amazed me myself is kind of first when I investigated where the project was actually planned, to discover that it was planned at the end of Friedrichstrasse, which is the key street in Friedrichstadt, on a triangular residual site between the Friedrichstrasse station, the Spree and the street. So in certain ways it seemed kind of an eminently pragmatic proposal that since there was a triangular site left over, so to speak, in the neoclassical grid of Friedrichstrasse, to put a triangular glass building there. But I think that the real intention of Mies is in a way more ambitious still, namely to explicitly take up a theme, a neoclassical theme that was already latent in the ideas of the planners of Friedrichstrasse, because Friedrichstrasse is an urban grid that culminates every time in a series of geometrical figures. The circle here, an octagon there, and a square there. And I think that by producing this triangular tower, Mies was explicitly planting his scheme kind of in this series of geometrical culminations, and thereby making what was in fact a residue as an element in a neoclassical composition. And of course, by building it and not leaving it a plaza, but by actually kind of building it and building it in a scale that was completely beyond and outside the neoclassical conception, he also broke the mold. And I think that that is one of the most interesting things that can be said about Mies, and by implication of this kind of metropolitan architecture of the early moderns as it was developed in Berlin. On the one hand, through the simple scale alone, a definite break with the past, but on the other hand, through kind of refinement of placement, refinement of materials, and simply refinement, a very subtle and strong relationship with the elements that were there in the city, and in other words, a kind of superb ambiguity between continuity and rupture. And I think that was something that was very exciting to discover. Something rather shocking to discover when I presented this scheme, and the scheme is ultimately here, to the jury that consisted of, among others, 6 eminent historians, that not a single historian knew that the scheme was intended for this particular location, and therefore not a single historian knew of this kind of logic that Mies presumably intended. And I think that I mean, when I discovered that in the presentation of the jury, it really confronted me with the kind of incredibly thin ice at which, at this moment, all thinking architects are forced, on which all thinking architects are forced to skate. Another extremely beautiful invention of the Berlin version of modernity has always been to me the courtyard house, also of Mies, but also by a whole series of other Berlin architects, Mies, Hilbersheimer and others. And what I have always found incredibly seductive and original about them is the kind of simple discovery that within the extremely rigid framework of a courtyard, the architect then can have complete freedom to pursue his own form of randomness. And I think that again here, in this let's say more or less theoretical layout of Mies, you can see this ambiguity. On the one hand, a form of house that is radically new, a form of house that doesn't tolerate any repetition, a form of house where each house literally has the ambition to be an invention, but at the same time an accumulation of these houses that is eminently historical, and with which you can build the city exactly in the same way as you could build Pompeii. And I think that this, let's say, richness of being both radically new and traditional is maybe a Berlin tradition, and I think it's something that is very exciting about this period of work. Anyway, the scheme that I will show was for a 4-block area in Friedrichstadt. You recognize the grid. Here is the circle. It was in a very highly charged area because it had a length of 400 meters here along the Berlin Wall. It was 4 blocks across on an intersection here of Friedrichstrasse and here of Kochstrasse. And the 4 blocks were this one, a small one, and a very long one. The blocks themselves were typically Berlin, which is to say some remnants of the past, some remnants of the 19th century city. A lot of 50s and 60s interventions that didn't take into account anything, any historical evidence, that were usually not on the street and that were radically dissociated from the existing context, plus some 70s buildings that tried to be kind of more polite and that were already kind of beginning to feel the pull of the kind of historical city as it was then being discovered. The scheme dates from 1981-82, a period in which it was almost completely predictable that architects would simply take the blocks and repair, in quotes, them by reimagining or reconfiguring, to use the horrible American word, reconfiguring the historical grid of the city. And it is true that a scheme like this one by Aldo Rossi, interchangeable with almost 80% of all the other entrants, except of course in the style and the look of the building, was also within the kind of puritanical framework and predictable insistence of IBA, or the explicit insistence of IBA that part of Berlin should, as much as possible, become as it had been in a kind of mythological past. That it was clear that this kind of proposal was to be expected. At the same time, I had also been already very interested in the years before in Berlin, an interest that had been stimulated very strongly through a collaboration with the German architect Matthias Ungers. And 2 years before the start of this competition, we were involved in a kind of theoretical proposal for Berlin that we ourselves interpreted more or less as a kind of anti-IBA, or a kind of an ironical commentary on IBA. Because as IBA was preparing to repair the city, we wanted to ask some kind of very, let's say, provocative or obnoxious questions, where we said it is very ironical, Berlin is a very interesting situation or condition for several reasons. One of them is that for political reasons, the territory of the city is given. Berlin is one of the few cities that cannot shrink and cannot extend. Ever since the construction of the wall, there's been a second phenomenon that is extremely interesting, and that phenomenon is that the city, from a population of around 6 million people, declined in a fairly continuous downward curve to something like 2 million. So let's say over a period of 20 years, half of the original population of the city somehow had to maintain and support the existing city that in itself had
remained the same in size. So we asked the question, isn't it very strange to use exactly this city as an example for the reconstruction of the European city? This city that through the decline of its population theoretically doesn't really demand to be repaired and doesn't really demand more physical substance, doesn't really demand more architecture, and what it actually demands is a kind of concept of how fewer people can inhabit the same territory and maintain some kind of urbanity or urban life. So in our proposal,
we made a fairly radical and irresponsible step where we said the city of Berlin consists of a series of very beautiful fragments. They're either beautiful for architectural reasons, but they can also be beautiful because the kind of life that exists in a particular enclave, or in any case for many different reasons. So what we do, instead of repairing the city of a whole or declaring the city as a whole a museum, we will identify a series of fragments that deserve to remain forever and to be preserved and even reinforced, so they could be even intensified. And then we declare the rest of the city not to be abandoned, but certainly to be progressively erased. So that rather than kind of to contradict the decay of Berlin through the medium of architecture and simply by creating more architecture, we proposed that it was also possible to design the decay of the city and to exploit the decay of the city, to erase former parts of the city and to invent a new life for those former parts of the city. Because what would happen in this the area around those islands that we were going to preserve was, of course, the whole spectacle and the whole spectrum of life in the 20th century, so that all those processes that now can only exist in historical cities with great friction or great hostility would find more or less unlimited space to assert themselves and to exist and disappear, wither away, and kind of, in other words, it freed enormous areas for improvisation and in general for all those 20th century elements that exist only with difficulty with the historical city, be it highways, shopping centers, drive-in cinemas, etc., etc. And I think that this particular image is maybe something that of the kind of quality of the nothingness in between those architectural fragments. We didn't see it as a kind of nothingness in terms of architecture, but as a kind of potentially highly charged field where it was possible to be in love, kind of witness films about airplanes and be passionately interested in trains all in one experience without, again, the containment and the oppression of architecture. So it was with those, let's say, two images in mind, those two contradictory images in mind, that we started on this competition. On the other hand, a very strong conviction that the predictable solution of the typical IBA competition was to be resisted, and on the other hand, the definition of the issue that Berlin was facing was to define a low-key urbanity or a low-intensity or urbanism, an urbanism that didn't really consist of a lot of form or substance, but that nevertheless could cover large areas of the city with a kind of dignified and desirable and maybe even impressive form of architecture. So instead of our kind of repair, it was a competition that was organized in such a way that each block had 5 architects, so there was a total of 20 architects involved, and all those 20 architects had to first propose solutions for the 4 blocks and then concentrate on one block in particular. I mean, that also shows something about the incredible casualness with which architectural production is now treated, to invite 20 geniuses to make proposals that will kind of surely never be realized. But anyway, the block that we had to do in detail was this one, ferociously interesting and difficult. This is checkpoint Charlie, the famous transition from west to east, and there was a length of 300 meters with the Berlin Wall. But we this was the northern edge of the site. And of course, let's say the first day that we were walking around there with this group of architects, everybody was completely dutifully horrified and kind of and extremely determined to not fall victim to this gloominess, to kind of make proposals that would reintroduce vitality in this area. But I felt a strong sympathy and again moral seduction even by the incredible richness of these traces, and I almost walked around here like I used to do in Pompeii, and kind of felt some of the same suggestiveness in these traces of abandoned activity here. This was the southern face of the block, where there was a laundry that Joseph Kleinhuis had committed himself to removing, but that in the say for 10 years is still standing there, frustrating the intentions of the architects. And again here I also was seduced by the kind of strange beauty of this arrangement, the Volkswagen, the tarmac, the road, the wall, the tree, and the second wall. In other words, what I found fascinating is this was the western edge of the site, where there was a kind of strange group of bums or back ladies, in Berlin even a back man, who were living in a kind of strange encampment consisting of caravans, tents, and other debris. And there again, what was extremely bizarre and impressive was the way in which this kind of small scale related extremely well, both with the wall and with the kind of bizarre evidence of its historical past that is so overwhelming there. In other words, I was kind of really impressed how the small scale could coexist with those seemingly overwhelming other elements. But this is then the eastern side, Checkpoint Charlie. And what the scheme consists of will in fact not be kind of very surprising. Basically, for the main block, for the big block that Aldebossi won, I proposed that the only way to create coherence in what was inevitably a chaos of very heterogeneous elements was to find a retroactive concept for the chaos, and simply to reinforce it by making every fragment part of a kind of seeming composition of fragments, of earlier fragments. And what we proposed to do on these blocks here was simply to cover all those areas that were vacant with carpet type patio housing in the Mission tradition, but also in the tradition of all those miniature elements that were already there. So the scheme was in an aggressive way both utopian and non-utopian. Utopian in the sense that it resisted the preference of IBA, and utopian or anti-utopian in that it simply accepted all the conditions that were there and built buildings where they could be built, and simply didn't have any other pretensions than to complete the site as a whole. So here again you see the composition for the big block, and here these villas built on those areas that were available, with the main gap between on Checkpoint Charlie between two superb 19th century villas filled with one pavilion for the police, one for the customs, and one for the American army. Here an overall view of the scheme. Here, let's say the situation at Checkpoint Charlie between the two villas, and a carpet of incredibly luxurious houses there. I mean, it was supposed to be social housing. My argument was that there were, it was extremely unfair to put poor people on the wall in high-rise or relative high-rise apartments, that it was much more logical to use these vacant sites and to create both incredibly luxurious worlds there that were, through the kind of fact that there were patio houses, excluded from the outside world. It is a scheme on which I worked with Stefano de Martino mostly, and it is, I mean, and let's say we were so obsessed at that point that every single apartment did, or villa had a completely different plan, different story, different ideology, and different possibilities. And I still think that it is one of our most interesting schemes in kind of the brutality with which it accepts conditions, and at the same time the kind of ability in which within those extremely crude conditions it finds some kind of idyllic world. Sorry for the mirror image. This was the face of Checkpoint Charlie, where you see the very American kind of architecture, one for the US Army, one for the customs, and one for the police. So that's how we dealt with this gap, and here in a way we dealt with it in the same way, except there was a kind of slight variation, namely that where this was kind of simply a flat carpet without kind of much three-dimensional articulation, simply because there were high-rise buildings here and here. But here we were had an enormous flat site in an area that didn't have any major buildings. So there we felt that it was maybe responsible to have buildings that consist of 2 floors, with this the ground floor, and this is a kind of close-up of the ground floor, and this the second floor. Here you see a drawing of that corner, kind of which is built up, kind of, let's say, the plan of the first floor and the second floor. I'm tempted to leave these drawings kind of for a very long time, simply because I still think they're almost irresponsibly beautiful, and also kind of for their amazing ability also to incorporate even the Berlin Wall into and to contaminate in a positive sense even the Berlin Wall. You can maybe imagine the shock that the project gave when I presented it. All the other entrants had in fact made schemes that were simply perimeter blocks, even along the Berlin Wall, with very nice drawings how the sun would kind of penetrate the attic. I mean, there were drawings where really the kitchen facing the Berlin Wall kind of show, proving that there would be very nice living spaces that had a view, of course, that was extremely horrible. And on the day of the jury, one of the German vocals was eaten alive by Alsatian dogs. 400 meters of the jury place. Anyway, so the scheme was won by Boyarsky, but because there was a French communist ideologue in the jury, Bernard Huet, he said that we deserved one little prize, and that was to build the 3 pavilions for the American Army, the police, and and the customs of Checkpoint Charlie. And I thought that in itself was an extremely exciting idea, and we prepared ourselves to do it. But it was impossible within the logic of IBA to have these kind of freestanding pavilions, because the ideology is so completely overwhelming. So after a lot of negotiations, we could build the buildings, but superimposed on building was to be an apartment building between the two villas. So I will show you now very quickly, because otherwise I will talk too long, some images of the apartment building where I, contrary to what Peter Cook is suggesting, I don't have any horror stories to communicate. On the contrary, things are going relatively smoothly, and I think it will be under construction even before August. Go back one. Even this, I mean, this. Of course, for a long time, it was very difficult, very hard for us to conceptualize how these pavilions could coexist with an apartment building. One thing that really helped was an English or London precedent of kind of service stations that are sometimes built under apartment buildings, a typical Anglo-Saxon form of pragmatism. Once we had kind of taken that metaphor, things became easier. We considered this situation, which is in fact completely dominated by the traffic of American Army buses and the possibilities to check cars on drugs and other elements. So in other words, it's completely devoted by traffic. There are 3 pavilions. Then there is a kind of platform, and above that platform starts the apartment building. And in the apartment building, we resurrected a lot of the types of the modern movement: the street in the air, the duplex, the maisonette, the deck, all things that are currently drastically out of fashion, but that in this scheme we could resurrect and combine in this kind of layering of projects. So what you will see is first the scheme for this for Checkpoint Charlie itself, and then the kind of layers of the schemes above. This is the street in the air. It consists of a kind of walkway, and then it is a kind of view to the checkpoint. Then there is a kind of balustrade and a series of apartments accessible above, and then above it you see kind of a layer of penthouses on the scheme. So that is the top of the building. The penthouses, the apartments, the street in there, and then a series of duplexes that are accessible from the deck on the other side, which I will show. And then you see the entrance to the apartment building and the pavilions that are slit underneath the apartment block. The American Army, at some point we were going to design a museum of the American Army, but the only element of indoctrination is this kind of snail-like form, which is now a visitor center in which busloads of Americans are informed about the activity of the American Army and the logic of the American presence in Berlin. This is the back, which kind of explains more of the building. Again, you see the sokol of the building, which is devoted to the American Army. Then the platform, gardens, and duplexes that have direct access to the gardens. And so I want to end on this picture, which I think gives a good impression, of let's say a series of projects over 6 years, and the final result of our work with IBA in Czech Conchal.